February 2nd, 1959. The Northern Ural Mountains, a place the local Mansi people call the Mountain of the Dead. It's a silence so deep it feels heavy, like the air itself is pressing down on you. In this vast, frozen white hell, 9 hikers are about to vanish from the face of the earth. But they didn't just disappear. That would have been a mercy compared to what search parties found weeks later. Imagine stumbling upon a tent on a desolate slope. It's half buried in snow. But here is the detail that keeps investigators awake at night, 60 years later. The tent wasn't torn open from the outside by a bear or a wolf. It was slashed open from the inside. In a frantic, desperate panic, 9 experienced mountaineers chose to cut their way out of their only shelter and run into the pitch-black night, into -30-degree weather. Without boots, without coats, some were wearing only their underwear. What could possibly be so terrifying inside that tent that freezing to death in the darkness seemed like the better option? When they found the bodies, the puzzle only got darker. Fractured skulls, chests crushed with the force of a car crash, but with no external bruising. One victim was missing her tongue, another, his eyes, and on their clothes, traces of radiation. The Soviet government sealed the files. They called it an unknown compelling force. But forces don't leave footprints. Forces don't leave victims looking like they saw the devil himself before they died. We are about to walk the same path they did. We are going to look at the evidence the authorities tried to bury. But before we step into the snow, I want to know who is walking with me tonight. Go down to the comments right now and tell me which city you are watching from. I want to see how far this mystery has traveled. Are you safe and warm? Because where we're going, the cold is the least of our worries. To understand the death, you have to understand the life. You need to know that these weren't amateurs. They weren't kids who got lost on a weekend camping trip. This was a squad of elite hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were young, yes, most in their early 20s, but they were tough as nails. They were the kind of people who looked at a map of the most unforgiving terrain in Russia and saw a playground. Leading them was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a born leader. He was brilliant, ambitious, and rigorous about safety. He was the guy who checked the gear 3 times, the guy who calculated the calories, the weight of the packs, the route. He was chasing a Grade 3 certification, the highest level of hiking difficulty available in the Soviet Union at the time. To get it, they had to cover nearly 200 miles across the northern Urals in the dead of winter. It was supposed to be their triumph, a testament to their strength and Soviet endurance. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women. Look at their photos from the days before the hike. You see smiles. You see Yuri Doroshenko and George Krivonashenko joking around. You see Zenaida Kolmogorova, popular and spirited, laughing with the guys. They look invincible. They look like they have their whole lives ahead of them. And in a way, that makes the tragedy hit harder. Because when you look at those grainy black and white photos, you realize you are looking at ghosts. They took the train to Ivdel, arriving in the early hours of January 25th. The mood was electric. They were singing songs, trading stories with locals, buying last-minute supplies. There was zero sense of foreboding, no bad omens, just the excitement of the adventure. They took a truck, then a bus, finally reaching the last outpost of civilization, a gloomy settlement called Vijay. This was the edge of the world. Beyond this point, there were no doctors, no police, no help. Just the mountains and the Mansi tribes who had lived there for centuries. And this is where fate decided to play a cruel trick on one of them. Yuri Yudin. Remember that name. Yuri was part of the original 10. He was ready to go. But as they began the trek, his back flared up. Chronic sciatica. The pain was blinding. He tried to push through, but he knew he would slow them down. It was a heartbreaking decision. But on January 28th, Yuri Yudin hugged his friends goodbye. He handed over his share of the supplies. He probably felt like a failure as he watched them ski away into the tree line. He watched Igor, Zeneda, and the others turn into small dots against the white snow until they disappeared. He didn't know he was the luckiest man in Russia. He didn't know he was the only one who would ever grow old. The remaining 9 pressed on. For the first few days, everything went according to plan. We know this because they kept diaries. They took photos. It's eerie reading those journals now. They complain about the cold, sure. They joke about the food. They talk about the beautiful scenery. It's all so normal. It's so mundane. On January 31st, they arrived at the edge of the highland area. They began to climb. The weather was getting worse, the wind picking up, whipping snow into their faces, stinging their eyes. They realized they had veered slightly off course due to the low visibility. They were heading towards the slope of Kholat Syakhl. In the local Mansi language, it translates roughly to Dead Mountain. Now, historians will tell you it actually means something more like mountain without game or barren peak. But given what happened, the mistranslation feels more like a prophecy. Instead of losing altitude to find shelter in the forest, which would have been the safer, more logical choice, Dyatlov made a decision that experts still argue about today. He decided to set up camp right there on the exposed slope. Why? Was he confident? Did he want to practice a slope camp for their certification? Or was he afraid of losing the altitude they had fought so hard to gain? We will never know his exact reasoning, but we know they leveled out a space in the snow. They pitched the large canvas tent. They laid out their skis beneath it for insulation. They took off their wet boots and hung them up to dry. They changed into warmer, dry clothes for sleeping. They broke out a slab of cured ham and some crackers for dinner. They even wrote a satirical newspaper they called the Evening Otorten, joking about romance and hiking politics. The mood was light. They were cold, but they were together, and they were safe. So imagine the scene. It's roughly 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. on February 1st. The sun has set. The darkness is absolute. The wind is howling outside, battering the canvas walls. But inside, it's relatively cozy. They are winding down. Some are already drifting off to sleep. Everything is fine. And then, chaos. It didn't happen gradually. It wasn't a slow realization that something was wrong. It was immediate. Something happened in that darkness that terrified 9 hardened survivors so completely that they lost their minds. Think about the psychology of panic. If you hear a wolf outside, you grab a knife. If the tent collapses from snow, you dig it out. You don't grab a knife and slash the fabric towards the danger, unless the danger is already inside with you, or unless what is coming down that mountain is so overwhelming, so alien, that the only thought in your reptilian brain is run. They burst out of the tent. No organization, no formation, just a mad scramble into the freezing void. One of them is wearing only a single sock. Another is barefoot. They leave the knives. They leave the hatchets. They leave the food. They leave the only things that can keep them alive. They run down the slope towards the tree line, nearly a mile away. But here is the thing that turns this from a tragedy into a mystery. When investigators looked at the footprints later, they saw something strange. The tracks weren't running. They were walking, walking calmly in a line down the mountain to their deaths. Were they being marched, or were they in a trance? And as they descended into the darkness of the cedar forest, they had no idea that the horror was just beginning, because whatever drove them off that mountain wasn't done with them yet. Silence. That is all that came from the mountains. February 12th was the deadline. That was the day Igor Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram to the sports club in Sverdlovsk, announcing that they had returned to civilization. But the 12th came and went. Then the 13th. By the 15th, the families weren't just worried. They were frantic. You have to remember, this was the Soviet Union. Communications weren't instant, but reliability was everything. If Dyatlov said he would message, unless he couldn't. It took until February 20th for the first rescue groups to mobilize. It was a massive operation. Military helicopters, planes, student volunteers from the institute, even local Mansi hunters were drafted in. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was the size of a small country and covered in 5 feet of snow. For 6 days, they found nothing. Just white, endless emptiness. The pilots flying overhead saw nothing but the jagged teeth of the Urals. Then, on February 26th, a student volunteer named Mikhail Ravine spotted something odd on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, a tiny, unnatural patch of color against the monochromatic landscape. It was the tent. When Ravine and the other searchers skied up to it, their hearts must have dropped into their stomachs. The tent was half collapsed, covered in snow, but clearly visible, and it was dead silent. They shouted names. Igor! Zina! Nothing but the wind. They used an ice axe to chop through the hard-packed snow covering the entrance. What they found inside froze them in their tracks. The tent was empty, but it wasn't looted. It wasn't ransacked. Everything was neatly organized. Boots were lined up in a row. Backpacks were stacked. There was money, cameras, diaries, and food. The only thing missing was the people. But then they saw the cuts. The canvas hadn't been torn by the wind. It had been slashed. And as I mentioned before, the experts later confirmed the cuts were made from the inside. Step into their shoes for a second. You are a rescuer. You are standing on a freezing mountain slope, looking at a tent that has been cut open by people desperate to get out, but who left their shoes behind. You look down at the snow and you see the footprints. 8 or 9 sets of tracks, some made by socks, some by bare feet, one even by a single Valenki boot. They lead away from the tent, down the slope, toward the tree line about a mile away. The tracks tell a disturbing story. They weren't running. The spacing of the footprints suggests a walking pace. They were grouped together. They didn't scatter. They walked, half naked, into the freezing death, side by side. About 500 yards down the slope, the tracks disappeared, buried under fresh snow. The rescuers had only one option: follow the direction of the footprints into the forest. They descended towards the edge of the woods, where a large, ancient Siberian cedar tree stood. It was a landmark, something solid in the shifting snow. Underneath that cedar, the mystery turned into a horror show. They found the remains of a small fire, but it wasn't a roaring bonfire meant to save 9 lives. It was pitifully small, and next to the fire were the first 2 bodies, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. We call them the 2 Yuris. They were lying side by side in the snow. Here is where the logic completely breaks down. Both men were stripped to their underwear. No shoes, no gloves, just thin shirts and underpants. Krivonishenko had a burn on his leg. There were burns on his foot. But looking closer at the cedar tree itself, the rescuers noticed something even stranger. The lower branches of the tree had been snapped off, all the way up to 15 feet high. Think about the physical effort required to climb a frozen tree in the dark with numb hands and bare feet snapping thick branches. Why? Were they trying to get wood for the fire? Maybe, but the branches were found scattered around, unused. Were they climbing to get a vantage point? Were they looking back up the slope at the tent? What were they watching? Or more terrifyingly, what was watching them? Searchers found traces of skin and muscle tissue embedded in the bark of the tree. These men had climbed so frantically or held on so tightly that they tore their own flesh apart. Their hands were burned, not just from the fire, but seemingly from trying to keep warm by clutching the embers. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated desperation. But where were the others? 2 bodies accounted for, 7 missing. The searchers turned their eyes back towards the slope, looking from the cedar tree back up towards the abandoned tent. And there, buried under layers of snow, they found 3 more. They were spaced out, as if they had been caught in a deadly relay race. Closest to the cedar tree was Igor Dyatlov, the leader. He was lying on his back, one arm thrown up as if protecting his head or reaching out. He was clutching a birch branch. He was dressed a little better than the 2 Yuris, but still tragically underdressed for the conditions. He had no shoes, just socks. Further up the slope was Zenaida Kolmogorova. She was found face down. The snow around her was stained with blood from her nose. She was the one who was the heart of the group, the one everyone loved. She had fought hard. Her position suggested she was crawling desperately back up the mountain, back towards the tent they had fled from. And then even further up, closest to the tent, but still far away, was Rustem Slobodin. He was also face down. And he provided the first clue that this wasn't just a simple case of hypothermia. When they examined Slobodin, they found his skull was fractured. It was a crack in the bone, 6 inches long. Doctors said it could have happened from a fall, maybe hitting a rock hidden in the snow. But he also had bruised knuckles, like he had been in a fistfight. So, let's reconstruct the scene based on these 5 bodies. They fled the tent. They made it to the cedar tree. They tried to build a fire. The 2 Yuris died first, likely from the cold. The others, realizing the fire wasn't enough, or perhaps thinking the danger at the tent had passed, decided to go back. They stripped the clothes off their dead friends, a gruesome but necessary survival tactic, and tried to march back up that deadly slope to get their gear. But the mountain didn't let them. It picked them off, one by one. Dyatlov, Zenaida, Slobodin. They froze to death in the open, trying to return to the only shelter they had. It was a tragedy, certainly. A horrific accident caused by panic and cold. That's what the investigators wanted to believe. It was neat. It was sad, but explainable. Hypothermia makes you do crazy things. It makes you feel hot when you are freezing, causing you to strip off clothes, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. It makes you irrational. The case seemed close to being closed, but there was a problem. A massive, glaring problem. We only have 5 bodies. Where were the other 4? They were nowhere near the cedar tree. They weren't on the slope. The searchers poked the snow with long metal rods for weeks. Nothing. The seasons began to change. The snow began to melt. February turned to March. March turned to April. The Soviet authorities were getting impatient. They wanted this wrapped up. They wanted to write accident on the file and bury it. But the families demanded answers. And finally, in May, 3 months after the incident, nature gave up the rest of the group. A searcher found a piece of clothing near a ravine, about 75 yards away from the cedar tree, deep in the woods. They started digging. Deep under the snow, 4 meters down, in a flowing creek bed carved out by the melting snow, they found the remaining 4 hikers. And this is where the story shifts. If the first 5 bodies suggested a tragedy, these final 4 bodies screamed of a massacre. The autopsy of the first 5 showed death by hypothermia. But when the coroner laid Lyudmila, Zolotaryov, and the others on the table, he stepped back in horror. These weren't just frozen bodies. These were broken dolls. Semyon Zolotaryov had his chest crushed inward, ribs broken on the right side. Lyudmila Dubinina had her ribs broken on both sides, her chest flail-chesting into her heart. Nikolai had a crushed skull, a fracture so severe it was comparable to being hit by a car moving at 50 miles per hour. But here's the detail that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. There were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts on the skin that matched the internal devastation. It was as if they had been squeezed to death by a giant hand. And then the coroner looked at their faces. Lyudmila was missing her eyes. She was missing her tongue. In fact, the entire muscle floor of her mouth was ripped out. Zolotaryov was missing his eyes too. The soft tissue of their faces was gone. The Soviet investigators looked at each other. They had a tent cut from the inside. They had victims with crushed bones, but no bruises. They had missing organs, and they had traces of radiation on their clothes. How do you explain that? How do you explain a force that can crush a human chest without breaking the skin? The nightmare wasn't over. The discovery of the bodies in the ravine didn't provide answers. It shattered every theory they had. Because if the first group died of cold, what on earth happened to the group in the ravine? Let's sit with those 4 bodies in the ravine for a moment. Because the more you look at them, the less sense any of this makes. When the coroner, Boris Vozrozhdeny, examined the first 5 bodies found on the slope, he was confident. Hypothermia. It's tragic, but it's natural. The body shuts down. You go to sleep, you die. But when he got to the ravine 4 in May, his confidence evaporated. He was looking at trauma that didn't belong on a hiking trip. It belonged in a war zone. Thibaut Brignoles had a depressed skull fracture that would have instantly incapacitated him. We are talking about a piece of bone driven deep into the brain. You don't get that from falling into the snow. You get that from a hammer or a shockwave. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had chest fractures that were impossible to explain. The force required to break those ribs, front and back, multiple fractures, was calculated to be similar to the impact of a car hitting a pedestrian at 40 miles per hour. But here is the detail that the report highlights, the detail that conspiracy theorists have been screaming about for decades. There was no external damage. If a bear crushes your chest, it tears your skin. If you fall off a cliff onto rocks, you have abrasions, cuts, bruises. These bodies had none of that. It was as if a high-pressure wave had slammed into them, shattering their bones from the inside out, leaving the skin untouched. And then the soft tissue. Lyudmila's missing tongue, her missing eyes, Zolotaryov's missing eyes. Now, skeptics will tell you, and they have a point, that these bodies were lying in a running stream for months. Water, decomposition, and small scavengers can do terrible things to a face. It's gruesome, but it happens. But the medical examiner noted something odd about Lyudmila's mouth. He said the stomach contained roughly 100 grams of coagulated blood. That implies she was alive when the injury happened. She was swallowing blood. Was her tongue ripped out? Or did she bite it off in a seizure of unimaginable pain? We also have to look at their clothes. This sounds trivial compared to the injuries, but it tells us about their final hours. They were wearing each other's clothes. Ludmila was wrapped in a pair of trousers that belonged to Krivonishenko, one of the Yuris found dead under the cedar tree. Zolotaryov was wearing a hat and coat that didn't belong to him. This confirms a timeline of pure horror. It means the group split up. The two Yuris died first at the cedar tree. The Ravine group was there with them. They stripped the cooling bodies of their friends, desperate for warmth. They cut the clothes off the dead to try and save themselves. Then they moved deeper into the woods, into the ravine, trying to build a snow den, trying to hide from the wind or from whatever was hunting them. They survived longer than the others. They had time to think. They had time to realize they were going to die. And then, just to add one more layer of high strangeness to the mix, we have the radiation. During the autopsy, for reasons that were never fully explained, the authorities decided to check the clothes for radioactive contamination. Why? It's 1959. You don't bring a Geiger counter to a hiking accident unless you suspect something specific. And guess what? They found it. Beta radiation was found on the sweaters and pants of the hikers in the ravine. It wasn't background radiation, it was concentrated. When they washed the clothes, the radiation levels dropped, which suggested it was dust. Radioactive dust settled on their clothes. Where did it come from? There were no nuclear testing sites marked on the maps in that immediate area. So you have 9 dead bodies. You have inexplicable blunt force trauma. You have radiation. You have a tent cut from the inside. What did the Soviet government do? They panicked. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was a serious man. He was thorough. But as the evidence mounted, he started receiving calls from high-ranking party officials. They told him to wrap it up. They told him to stop looking for a murder weapon. They told him to classify the findings. Ivanov later admitted, years after the fall of the Soviet Union, that he was pressured to exclude everything related to flying spheres from the case files. Yes, flying spheres, because while the hikers were dying on the mountain, another group of hikers, about 30 miles south, looked up into the night sky. They saw strange, glowing orange orbs floating over Kolatsiakal. They weren't airplanes. They weren't stars. They were moving intelligently. The Meteorological Service confirmed there were no rocket launches scheduled for that night. But the military refused to comment. Ivanov had testimonies from witnesses who saw these lights. He had sketches, and he was ordered to bury all of it. On May 28, 1959, the case was officially closed. The conclusion is perhaps the most famous and frustrating sentence in forensic history. The cause of death was listed as an unknown compelling force. Not murder, not avalanche, not animal attack. A compelling force. It's a phrase that admits everything and says nothing. It's the government saying, "We know something powerful killed them, but we aren't going to tell you what it was." They sealed the area. For 3 years, no skiers or hikers were allowed near the DyatlovPass. What were they hiding? If it was just an avalanche, why close the mountain? If it was just a tragedy, why the secrecy? The funerals in Sverdlovsk were open casket, but just barely. The families were shocked by what they saw. The skin of the hikers wasn't the pale white of frozen corpses. It was a deep, dark orange-brown, like a brick. Some said it looked like a deep tan from the mountain sun. Others whispered it looked like chemical burns or radiation burns. The parents demanded answers, but the KGB was watching. In the Soviet Union of 1959, you didn't ask questions when the state told you to be quiet. You buried your dead, you drank your vodka, and you tried to forget. But the world didn't forget. The files sat in a dusty archive for decades. The legend grew. And now, looking back with modern eyes, we have to start peeling apart the theories. Because unknown compelling force isn't an answer, it's a cover-up. We have to look at the possibilities. Was it nature? A rare weather phenomenon like a slab avalanche or infrasound? Was it the Mansi natives protecting their sacred land? Was it aliens, those orange spheres in the sky? Or was it something much more human and much more sinister? There is a theory that fits many of the facts. It explains the radiation. It explains the crushing injuries. It explains the secrecy. And it centers on one man. Look at the group photo again. Count them. There is one face that stands out. He is older than the others. He isn't a student. He is a man in his late 30s with a mysterious past, a gold tooth, and a body covered in tattoos that were not common for honest Soviet citizens. His name was Semyon Zolotaryov. He joined the group at the very last minute. Nobody really knew him, and when they found his body in the ravine, he was wearing a camera around his neck. A camera that he didn't take off, even as he was freezing to death. Why would a man dying of cold worry about a camera? Unless the camera was the reason he was there in the first place. Unless the mission wasn't just a hike. What if I told you that Semyon Zolotaryov might not have been who he said he was? And what if the things he captured on that roll of film were the reason 9 people had to die? Let's look closely at Semyon Zolotaryov. In a group of idealistic students, he was the outlier. He was 37 years old. He had fought in the Great Patriotic War. He had seen things these kids couldn't imagine. He told the group he was a simple instructor, but his military records were strangely sparse for a man of his rank. The wildest, yet surprisingly plausible theory is the controlled delivery. Here is the scenario. It's the height of the Cold War. The KGB suspects that Western agents have infiltrated the Urals to spy on nuclear facilities. They need to catch them. So, they set a trap. They recruit Zolotaryov. They give him, or perhaps one of the other hikers, Krivonishenko, worked at a secret nuclear facility. Clothing dusted with radioactive isotopes. Not enough to kill them, but enough to trigger a Geiger counter. The plan? The hikers trek to the desolate mountain. They are supposed to meet a contact, maybe CIA agents dropped by parachute, masquerading as another hiking group. The delivery is the radioactive clothing, proof of a fake leak. The KGB is supposed to be shadowing them, ready to swoop in and make the arrest. But something goes wrong. Maybe the hikers stumble upon the meeting and realize what's happening. Maybe the foreign agents realize it's a setup. The deal turns into a slaughter. This theory explains the unknown compelling force as a cover-up. It explains why the government sealed the mountain. It explains the brutal, specific injuries of the Ravine group, crushed chests and skulls, consistent with being beaten by rifle butts, or specialized combat techniques designed to kill silently. It explains why Zolotaryov was wearing a camera he refused to abandon. Was he trying to take a photo of the attackers? And the tent? Slashed from the inside because the attackers were outside, ordering them out. They were forced to strip, a common interrogation technique to induce hypothermia and break the will. They were marched into the woods to die. It's a terrifying story. It fits the paranoia of the era. But it has holes. Why leave the money? Why leave the food? And why no extra footprints? If a kill squad was there, they were ghosts. So we have to look at the other side of the coin. We have to strip away the spies and look at the physics. We have to talk about the avalanche. For decades, experts said an avalanche was impossible. The slope of Kolatsiakol was too gentle, only about 30 degrees. There hadn't been a heavy snowfall that night. It didn't make sense. But in 2021, Swiss researchers, scientists who study snow dynamics for the Alps, published a paper that changed everything. They didn't propose a massive cinematic avalanche where the whole mountain collapses. They proposed a slab avalanche. Imagine a heavy plate of condensed snow, hard as concrete, resting precariously above the tent. The hikers, when they pitched their tent, cut into the slope to make a flat surface. This destabilized the snowpack. Then, the katabatic winds, heavy, freezing winds that flow downhill, battered the slope for hours. In the middle of the night, a slab of snow, maybe only the size of a car, but weighing tons, snapped loose. It slams into the tent while they are sleeping. It doesn't bury them deep, but it hits with crushing force. This explains the injuries. Zolotarev and Dubinina were on the side where the block hit. Their ribs snapped instantly under the weight. Thibaut Brignol's skull was crushed against the hard ground. Panic ensues. The tent is collapsing. They can't find the zipper in the dark. They are suffocating. Someone grabs a knife and slashes the canvas. They pile out into the freezing night. They are disoriented, injured, and terrified that a second, larger avalanche is coming. So they follow the protocol. Get to the tree line. Get away from the slope. They walk down. They don't run because some of them are gravely injured and need to be supported. They reach the cedar tree. They try to build a fire, but the wet wood won't burn well. The injured are dying. They realize they made a mistake. The tent is still there. The second avalanche never came. Dyatlov, Zina, and Rustam decide to go back up to get the sleeping bags. They freeze on the way. The others, in the ravine, succumb to their injuries and the cold. The snow eventually covers them, and as it melts and shifts in the spring, it drags the bodies into the stream, scrubbing the soft tissue from their faces. It is logical. It is scientific. It removes the monsters and the spies. But does it satisfy you? Does a slab avalanche explain why the radiation was there? Does it explain why the hikers, experienced mountaineers, would run a mile into the woods without grabbing a single pair of boots? Would an experienced guide like Zolotarev really make the amateur mistake of cutting into a dangerous snowpack? And there is one more thing. The infrasound theory. The wind, interacting with the unique shape of the mountain peaks, creates a low-frequency hum, a sound below the range of human hearing. This is called a Kármán vortex street. Infrasound has been proven to cause feelings of nausea, dread, and irrational panic. Could it be that the mountain itself drove them insane? That the wind vibrated their eyeballs until they saw ghosts? Vibrated their chests until they couldn't breathe, filling them with a primal terror that forced them to tear their way out of a perfectly good tent and run into the oblivion. We have the spies, we have the snow slab, we have the wind. But as we close the file on DyatlovPass, there is one final piece of evidence that haunts me. It was found in the last diary entry, written just hours before they died. The mood was high. They were joking. They were writing a satirical newspaper for the group. The headline they wrote was, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist." It was a joke. Surely, it was just a joke. Or was it? Because whatever they met in the dark that night, be it the KGB, a shifting plate of ice, or something entirely else, it left no survivors to tell the tale. The DyatlovPass remains a locked room mystery, where the room is a mountain range, and the killer has never been caught.